Hi everyone, so for my presentation I decided to do menstrual cycle phases, influences on the cardiorespiratory response to exercise in endurance trained females. The importance of this research is to better understand how exercising at high intensities during different phases of a female's menstrual cycle affects their cardiovascular system, such as ventilation, heart rate, oxygen consumption, respiratory exchange ratio, etc. Here's some background information provided about the three phases of the menstrual cycle. So the first phase is the early follicular phase, which starts at the onset of menstruation. During this phase, there's a low concentration of sex hormones. The next phase is the late follicular phase, and this is when estradiol or E2 begins to rise and later will reach its peak. There's also a peak in the luteinizing hormone, or LH, and the follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, prior to ovulation. The last phase is the mid-luteal phase. This is when progesterone increases and achieves its peak. Both E2 and progesterone have receptors in several tissues of the body. These hormones have an influence on more than just the reproductive functions. They may also influence other physiological systems such as the hypothalamus, cardiovascular system, kidney tubules, liver, skeletal muscle, and adipose tissue, all of which can impact a female's exercise performance. As for the methods of this study, it was a part of the IRON FEMME, which is an observational cross-sectional study that is performed by physically active and healthy women. In the study, there was a total of 21 female participants. The inclusion factors were you had to have a regular menstrual cycle, you had to be between the ages of 18 and 40 years old, you had to present healthy iron parameters, and you had to endurance train for 3 to 12 hours per week prior to the testing. They used a 3-step method to verify which phase each female was in. The method includes calendar-based counting, urinary luteinizing, hormone measurements, and a serum hormone analysis. There was a completion of other testing prior to the protocol to obtain each female's VO2 peak. Participants in the study followed a interval running protocol. So for this, they had to abstain from alcohol, caffeine, or any intense physical activity or sports practice 24 hours prior to the testing. They also had to give a blood sample and have their blood pressure measured. So for the running portion, they started with a 5-minute warm-up at 60% of their maximal aerobic speed. The actual test consisted of 8 bouts of 3 minutes at their 85% maximal speed, with a recovery in between of 90 seconds at 30% of their maximal speed. After the test was done, they did a cool down for 5 minutes at 30% of their maximal speed. Throughout the protocol, ventilation, breathing frequency, VO2, carbon dioxide production, heart rate, and energy expenditure were continuously measured. As for the results of the study, the main finding was that the menstrual cycle phase does have an effect on ventilation and heart rate when performing a high intensity interval running exercise. They also found that heart rate values were lower during the early follicular phase compared to the late follicular phase, although most other variables that were measured remained unchanged. Although there was significant differences in the sex hormone concentrations throughout the menstrual cycle, which you'll see on the next slide. There's a graph that demonstrates the differences. So here's the graph that I mentioned. You can see up top, it demonstrates the different hormone concentrations throughout the 3 different phases. You can see there are spikes throughout the 3 phases. Other than the early follicular, there's really no spikes. But the LH hormone really spikes in the late follicular phase. Same with estrogen and the FSH, but the LH really spikes there. And during the mid-luteal phase, progesterone and estrogen spike the most right there. At the bottom, it kind of just breaks down the protocol with little like pictures to help you understand, and then there's like the different times and stuff. So After reviewing this study, we can conclude that the sex hormone fluctuations do not appear high enough to disrupt any physiological adjustments that were caused from the high-intensity interval exercise. Like I stated before, ventilation and heart rate were the most altered. So from this, I think that heart rate-based training programs should consider a female's menstrual cycle phase. And all in all, when training females, I think that individual considerations need to be taken into account. This is relevant to exercise physiology because throughout the semester we have discussed hormones. In chapter 5, we talked about different sex hormones such as estrogen, and we also did a lab that involved LH and the FSH hormones. We also talked about menstrual cycles and what it means for females not to have their cycle or to have an irregular cycle. And lastly, it demonstrates how the human body responds to exercise throughout the various systems.